The bus ride incident at Christmas. A Miss Marple. Mystery. The bus trundled along the winding, snow-covered road, the rhythmic hum of its engine the only sound breaking the stillness of the night. Inside, the dim glow of the overhead lights cast soft shadows across the tired passengers. They were an assortment of people, wrapped in coats and scarves, their breaths rising in little puffs in the cool air. Some stared blankly out the windows, their eyes lost in the white haze of the winter landscape, while others were caught in quiet conversation, murmuring about the holiday season. Miss Marple, sitting near the back, glanced over the motley group. She had always been observant, never one to miss the smallest of details, a habit born from years of living in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead. But tonight, something was different. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the kind that seemed to hover in the air just beneath the surface. It was Christmas Eve, after all, and the bus was headed toward a small village up in the hills, where the holiday celebrations were sure to be peaceful and cheerful. Yet there was a nervous energy that Miss Marple couldn't quite place. She shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening slightly around the handle of her handbag. Her eyes scanned the passengers again, this time taking in more subtle details. The woman in the front, wrapped in a heavy coat, had her head tilted as if listening intently to something in the distance. The young man sitting across from her fidgeted with his gloves, his gaze flickering nervously between the others on the bus. And the elderly gentleman near the door, who had been quietly reading a newspaper, now looked up, his eyes narrowing as he seemed to study everyone around him. There was something about this group, Miss Marple thought, something that didn't quite fit. The kind of feeling one got when the pieces of a puzzle didn't quite align, no matter how hard you tried to make them. The bus hit a bump in the road, causing the passengers to jolt slightly in their seats. For a moment, Miss Marple's attention wavered as she looked out the window. The snow was falling harder now, the white powder swirling around in the wind, cloaking everything in a blanket of silence. The landscape outside appeared ghostly, the shadows of trees and fields blurred by the swirling snowflakes. Then a sudden scream pierced the air, sharp and terrified. The bus jerked to a stop, its brakes screeching as it skidded slightly on the slick road. Miss Marple's heart leapt into her throat as she turned toward the source of the scream. The woman in the front had risen from her seat, her hands pressed to her mouth in shock. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her body trembled. Something's wrong," the woman gasped, her voice barely a whisper. Miss Marple's mind raced, instinctively alert to the sudden change in the atmosphere. The passengers stirred uneasily, their faces pale with confusion and concern. The bus driver, a stout man with a round face, had already leapt from his seat and was standing by the doors, looking around anxiously. "What's happened?" he demanded, his voice gruff. The woman took a hesitant step toward the aisle, her legs shaking. There's something in the snow. It's a body." A collective gasp swept through the bus. The young man across from the woman stood up abruptly, his face pale. "A body?" he echoed, his voice trembling. "Are you sure?" The woman nodded, her eyes wide with terror. "I saw it when we hit the bump. I thought it was just a shadow at first, but then I saw the blood." Miss Marple felt a chill creep up her spine. The warmth of the bus seemed to vanish, replaced by the cold, sharp bite of the night air. She stood slowly, using the seat in front of her for support, and made her way to the front of the bus. The driver was still standing near the doors, his face tense as he peered out into the swirling snow. The other passengers had grown silent, their faces a mixture of disbelief and dread. "I'll go and have a look," Miss Marple said calmly, her voice cutting through the tension in the air. The driver turned to her, his brow furrowing. "It's too dangerous, ma'am. The snow's coming down too heavily, and we don't know what's out there." "I've had my share of strange occurrences, I'm afraid," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. "It won't hurt to take a look." She stepped carefully off the bus and into the snow, the cold biting at her skin as she walked toward the front of the vehicle. The snow was thick, almost blinding, but she could just make out a figure lying in the snow, sprawled unnaturally on the ground. The blood the woman had mentioned was visible, a dark stain against the white expanse. Miss Marple approached cautiously, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. There was something off about the way the figure was positioned, the arms and legs splayed out at odd angles. She reached the body and knelt down, her eyes narrowing as she examined it closely. The person was a man, likely in his late 30s, dressed in a heavy winter coat. His face was turned slightly to the side, his eyes wide open and glassy, staring up at the snow-covered sky. The blood pooled around his head, and there was a distinct mark on his neck, as though something had constricted it. Miss Marple stood up slowly, her heart heavy with the realization that this was no accident. The man had been murdered. She turned back toward the bus, where the passengers were watching her with a mix of curiosity and dread. The young man who had been so nervous earlier was now standing by the door, his eyes wide and his lips trembling. The elderly gentleman who had been so quiet earlier now looked at Miss Marple with a calculating gaze, his brow furrowed. "Miss Marple, what do you think happened?" The driver called from the door, his voice uncertain. "I believe we've just witnessed the beginning of something much darker," Miss Marple said softly, her mind already racing through the possibilities. This was no ordinary holiday incident. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, and she knew there was much more to this than met the eye. The Christmas Eve mystery had only just begun. The atmosphere inside the bus had shifted from uncertainty to dread. The passengers whispered among themselves, their voices low and shaky, as the bus continued to sit in the falling snow, isolated on the road. The driver stood just inside the door, his posture stiff, still processing the discovery. Miss Marple remained outside, carefully inspecting the body once more. There was no mistake. This was no accident, no simple misfortune. The man's face, frozen in an expression of shock, told its own grim story. His blood, dark against the pristine white snow, had already begun to freeze, and the silence of the night seemed to press in around them, thick and heavy. She stood for a moment, taking in the scene, her mind piecing together details in a way that only years of experience could cultivate. His clothing, black, high-quality wool, clearly not designed for such a rugged area, stood out against the stark, snowy landscape. The way his legs were positioned awkwardly, a position no living man would assume in death, made her heart beat faster. This was deliberate, calculated, not the result of a stumble or a fall. The strangulation mark on his neck confirmed it. Miss Marple's thoughts were already running ahead, considering who this man might have been and what connections he might have had with the passengers on the bus. The driver's voice snapped her back to the present. "What should we do now, Miss Marple?" he called from the door, his voice wavering. "We can't just leave him out there like that." Miss Marple glanced up at him, her face an impassive mask. "We'll need to call the authorities, of course," she said calmly, standing and brushing the snow from her gloves. "But first, we need to make sure the situation doesn't get worse." The passengers had been quiet since she had left to inspect the body, but now the murmur of conversation picked up again, louder and more frantic. She could hear fragments of words. "Who is he? Did he have family? Why was he here?" Miss Marple's mind was already at work, wondering what thread might connect the man to their journey. She returned to the bus and stepped inside, her eyes scanning the group. Everyone was watching her now, waiting for her to speak, for some clue to emerge, but she knew they were all just as confused as she had been only moments before. "I don't want to alarm anyone," Miss Marple said, her voice steady as she addressed the passengers, "but I believe one of you may have some knowledge of this man. I suggest we begin by introducing ourselves and sharing where we were all headed tonight." The silence that followed her words hung thick in the air. Miss Marple watched as each passenger looked to the others, the tension rising. Slowly, one by one, they began to speak. hesitant at first, as though unsure of how much to reveal. The woman who had screamed earlier was the first to speak up, her hands still trembling as she clutched her purse. I was just heading home," she said, her voice a little shaky. "I live in Redmore. I wasn't expecting anything like this." Her eyes darted nervously from one face to the next, her anxiety growing. A young man near the middle of the bus shifted in his seat. "I'm on my way to visit some friends in Brookfield," he said quickly. "I didn't see much of anything. Just that body lying out there." Miss Marple nodded, taking mental notes. The passengers had begun to open up, but none of their responses seemed to give her the answers she was looking for. The elderly gentleman by the door finally spoke. His voice was low, deliberate, and carried an air of authority. "I'm just a tourist, visiting relatives," he said, his eyes glinting with something sharp. "Not much more to say." Miss Marple met his gaze for a moment before turning to the young man who had been sitting so nervously earlier. "And you?" she asked gently, her eyes narrowing. The young man's eyes flickered uneasily. He looked around the bus, avoiding her gaze for a moment. "I'm just traveling through," he muttered. "No particular reason. Just wanted to get out of the city for a while." Miss Marple studied his expression closely. There was something there, something that didn't sit right. The way he avoided meeting her eyes, the subtle shifts in his posture. He was hiding something, she was sure of it. But what? Before she could continue her line of questioning, the bus driver interrupted. "We need to do something. We can't just sit here all night." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing with the questions that needed answering. "I'll speak with the authorities," she said firmly. "But before we do that, I need to make sure none of you leave the bus. We must remain together until we have more clarity on what's happened." The young man shifted again, glancing nervously out the window. "You can't seriously think one of us is involved, can you?" he asked, his voice growing more anxious. "I think we need to consider all possibilities," Miss Marple replied quietly. "This man didn't just end up dead in the snow for no reason. Someone on this bus may have the answers." The room fell silent again. No one spoke. Miss Marple's eyes swept across the group once more. There was fear, yes, but also something else. A tightness in their bodies, a stiffness in their movements that spoke of hidden secrets. She had learned long ago how to read the smallest of details, the way a person held their hands or shifted in their seat. It was in those subtle actions that the truth often hid, waiting to be uncovered. As she stood there, considering her next move, the wind outside howled, and the bus lurched slightly in the snowdrift. The cold air seemed to seep through the walls, as if the very earth was trying to shut them in. Miss Marple knew she had to move quickly. Whoever had committed this crime was still among them, and every minute they spent in that isolated place brought them closer to the truth and the danger of whatever lay ahead. The wind outside howled, a fierce, biting force that rattled the bus windows. Inside, the warmth of the cabin seemed to offer little comfort as the passengers shifted uneasily in their seats. Miss Marple stood near the front, her eyes scanning the room, taking in every subtle movement, every nervous glance. The body outside, still lying in the snow, was a grim reminder of the danger that had befallen them, and the sense of unease had only deepened as the minutes ticked by. The bus driver, whose name Miss Marple had yet to learn, was pacing back and forth near the door, his face etched with worry. He had tried several times to radio for help, but the storm had interfered with the signal, leaving them stranded without any communication with the outside world. The passengers, meanwhile, sat in tense silence, each one seemingly lost in their own thoughts. The woman who had first screamed, still clutching her purse, stared straight ahead, her eyes unblinking. The young man who had fidgeted earlier now appeared to be on edge, his gaze darting around the bus, his fingers tapping nervously on his knee. Miss Marple's eyes returned to him. There was something about him that unsettled her, something in the way he tried to avoid her gaze. his unease almost palpable. She had learned over the years to trust her instincts, and right now, every part of her was telling her that he was hiding something. But what? As she took a step toward him, the elderly man near the door spoke up, his voice smooth and measured, as though he had not been affected by the tension in the air. "I trust you have a plan, Miss Marple," he asked, his tone almost casual, as if they were discussing nothing more than a mild inconvenience. Miss Marple turned toward him, her gaze steady. "I do," she said softly, "but we need to stay calm and ensure everyone is accounted for. I suggest we remain here in the bus until help arrives, but in the meantime, I need to ask each of you a few questions." The elderly man raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Instead, his eyes shifted to the young man, who seemed to be growing increasingly uncomfortable under Miss Marple's scrutiny. She could feel the tension between them, a subtle but undeniable shift in the atmosphere. The old man's gaze was sharp, calculating as though he was silently weighing the situation and deciding whether he should speak up. Miss Marple took a deep breath and turned her attention back to the young man. "You seem quite nervous, young man," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Is there something you'd like to share with the group?" He hesitated, his eyes flickering to the window before darting back to Miss Marple. I don't know what you mean," he stammered. I'm just shaken up by all of this. It's a terrible thing, isn't it?" Miss Marple studied him for a long moment. There was something in his voice that didn't ring true, a tremor that suggested more than just nerves. She nodded slowly, choosing not to press him further for now. Instead, she turned her attention to the woman who had first noticed the body in the snow. "What did you see when you looked out the window?" she asked. The woman swallowed hard before answering. "I saw it when we hit the bump," she said, her voice unsteady. "At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but then I saw the blood. I don't know how it got there. I didn't see anyone around when we passed." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already processing the details. The blood, the position of the body. It was clear that this wasn't a random accident. Someone had placed the body there deliberately. But why? And who? The elderly man, who had been silent up until now, cleared his throat. "I think we've all had enough of these questions," he said, his voice low and commanding. "We're stuck here in the middle of a storm with no way to contact the outside world, and you're asking us all about what we saw. It's not helping anyone. We need to focus on practical matters, like figuring out how to get out of this mess." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing. The elderly man's tone was abrupt, but his words rang with a certain truth. They were stranded, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a murder and a snowstorm. There was a connection between the passengers, something hidden just beneath the surface, and she intended to uncover it. "I understand your frustration," Miss Marple said quietly, her eyes meeting the old man's. "But the only way out of this situation is to understand what's happened. Once we know the truth, we can take action. Until then, I'm afraid we're at the mercy of whatever this storm has in store for us." The elderly man's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing more. Miss Marple could feel the shift in the room, a palpable tension as the passengers began to realize that they were all caught in a web they could not escape. The young man, still fidgeting in his seat, shot a glance at the window before slumping back, his face pale. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her mind racing through the events of the night. The body, the passengers' reactions, the strange sense of unease that seemed to grip the bus. None of it added up, and yet she knew that every mystery had its answer, hidden somewhere among the clues waiting to be discovered. The storm raged on outside, the wind howling like a living thing, and the bus remained eerily still, as if it too was holding its breath. In that silence, Miss Marple could hear the faintest sound of a car engine in the distance. It was a small sound, almost drowned out by the storm, but it was enough to give her hope. Help was coming, at least she hoped it was, and with it, answers. But as the minutes passed and the sound of the engine faded into the night, Miss Marple realized that the true challenge was not waiting for rescue. It was unraveling the secrets hidden within this group of strangers before the danger reached them all. The bus was growing colder by the minute, despite the warmth of the engine still humming beneath them. The snow continued to fall outside in a thick, suffocating blanket, swirling around the windows and giving the world beyond the bus a dreamlike, almost unreal quality. Inside, the tension was palpable, thick and heavy, as each of the passengers seemed lost in their own thoughts. Their faces were a mixture of anxiety and curiosity, some nervously tapping their fingers or shifting in their seats, while others remained stock still, as if frozen by the events that had unfolded. Miss Marple had not missed the subtle shifts in demeanor since they had last spoken. The young man, still avoiding her gaze, had become even more withdrawn, his fidgeting now a constant, restless motion. The elderly man, who had been so quick to dismiss her earlier, was staring out of the window with a deep furrow in his brow, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as though he were trying to brace himself against the situation. The woman, who had first screamed upon seeing the body in the snow, seemed to have regained some composure, though her eyes were still wide with fear, flicking nervously around the bus as if she were expecting the world outside to suddenly break in. The driver, who had been pacing back and forth near the door, had finally sat down, his face pale and drawn. He glanced nervously at the snowstorm outside, then back to the passengers, as if waiting for someone else to take charge of the situation. Miss Marple knew he was a man out of his depth, and though she had no intention of taking command, she felt a quiet responsibility to steady the ship. Someone had to hold things together, and she had long since realized that, more often than not, that someone was her. "Has anyone else seen anything unusual?" she asked, her voice cutting through the heavy silence, though it came out quieter than she had intended. Her eyes swept over the group once more. The young man immediately looked down at his hands, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edges of his seat. The elderly man's gaze flicked briefly to Miss Marple before looking away again, his lips pressed into a thin line. The woman at the front of the bus, who had earlier been the most vocal, seemed to hesitate before she spoke. "No," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't think so. Not really." "Not really," Miss Marple echoed, raising an eyebrow. She could feel the woman's discomfort as if it were a tangible thing, the lie sitting just below the surface. The woman blinked, then seemed to steady herself, her shoulders straightening ever so slightly. "I don't know. I guess I was just in shock." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable, but her mind was already racing. It was a natural reaction to an event so horrific, but there was something in the woman's hesitation, a small shift in her voice that told Miss Marple there was more here than met the eye. The young man shifted again, his breath coming a little faster now. I didn't see anything. I didn't notice anything before. Before the body," he said, his voice cracking as he spoke, though his words seemed rehearsed. He shot another glance at Miss Marple, but this time his eyes met hers. And in that brief instant, Miss Marple could see the flicker of something in them, something that suggested guilt or fear or both. "Do you mind if I ask you a question, young man?" Miss Marple asked, her tone calm, even a little casual, though the scrutiny behind her words was clear. He nodded quickly, his gaze flicking to the door as though he were thinking of making a run for it. "Of course. I didn't see anything. I swear. I didn't ask whether you saw anything," Miss Marple replied, her voice softer now. "But I do wonder why you seem so intent on convincing me that you didn't." The young man's face paled. What do you mean?" "I mean that every time I look at you, you look like someone who's trying to hide something," Miss Marple said gently. "You've been on edge from the moment you got on this bus, and now, with a dead body outside, you're even more nervous." "I'm not hiding anything," he protested, though the volume of his voice betrayed. Him, his words almost too sharp, too defensive. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his. "Then why are you trembling, young man? Why are your hands so tightly clenched?" The young man swallowed hard, but before he could answer, the elderly man, who had remained quiet for some time, interjected. "Enough," he said in a low voice, his eyes flashing with irritation. "This is getting us nowhere. We're stuck in the middle of nowhere in a snowstorm with a dead body outside, and all this talk is just wasting time. We need to figure out what to do next." His words hung in the air, thick with frustration. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension was almost unbearable, the silence deafening in its weight. The young man sank back into his seat, his eyes darting to the elderly man, as though silently agreeing with the interruption. Miss Marple, however, remained calm. She had known people like him, people who had lived long enough to grow weary of the complications of life, who found it easier to cut through the questions and seek simple solutions. But Miss Marple knew better. She knew that this man, too, was hiding something. Everyone on this bus was hiding something, whether they realized it or not. And until those truths were brought to the surface, they were all trapped in this snowbound nightmare together. "Very well," Miss Marple said quietly. "We will wait for the authorities to arrive, but until then, I suggest we keep a close watch on each other. I believe one of you has information that can explain what's happened, and I won't rest until I find out what that is." The words were soft but firm, and for the first time that evening, the bus fell into complete silence. Even the wind outside seemed to pause, as if holding its breath, waiting for the next move to be made. The storm outside had reached a crescendo, the wind howling like a banshee, and the snow now came down in sheets, covering everything in a blanket of white. It felt as though the world had vanished, leaving only the bus and its uneasy passengers trapped in this desolate, frozen landscape. The warmth inside the bus had long since dissipated, replaced by a biting cold that seeped through the walls, no matter how tightly the driver had shut the doors. The engine hummed softly, but its warmth barely reached the back of the bus. Miss Marple could feel the chill in her bones, but it wasn't the cold that unsettled her. It was the silence, the oppressive tension that seemed to fill every corner of the bus. The passengers had all fallen into a sort of uneasy quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. And yet Miss Marple could sense the underlying current of suspicion and fear that pulsed through the air. The woman who had screamed earlier sat at the front, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes darting to the window and back again, as if she were afraid to be alone with her thoughts. The young man, whose nervousness had only intensified, was now seated, staring out the window, his face pale, his eyes wide, and his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. The elderly man, who had remained largely silent, had positioned himself near the back, as though surveying the entire group from his vantage point. Miss Marple shifted in her seat, her hands resting on her lap, the ever-present calmness in her demeanor belying the sharpness of her mind. She was piecing together the fragments of information, her mind working with a precision honed by years of observation. Each of these people, she realized, held a key. She had seen the smallest flickers of fear, the almost imperceptible shifts in posture, the nervous glances, the lingering silences. They were all hiding something, and she was determined to find out what. The young man shifted in his seat once more, and Miss Marple's eyes moved to him. He caught her gaze for a moment, then quickly looked away, his face flushed. Miss Marple knew she had his attention. The others had no idea what they were sitting on. Each of them, in their own way, was like a puzzle piece just waiting to fit into place, but she had yet to see how they all connected. "Why are you so nervous, young man?" she asked quietly, her voice cutting through the stillness. The young man froze, and for a moment, no one moved. The bus driver glanced nervously at the rearview mirror, and the elderly man stiffened, though he said nothing. The woman at the front looked up, her eyes flicking between Miss Marple and the young man, her face pale with concern. "I told you," the young man muttered, his voice shaky. "I'm just shaken up. This whole situation is just..." He trailed off, his words faltering, his gaze shifting toward the door as though he were considering making a run for it. Miss Marple remained still, her gaze never leaving his face. "You've been more than just shaken," she said softly, her tone calm but insistent. "You've been avoiding eye contact, fidgeting constantly, and now you're acting as if you want to leave the bus." His eyes flickered to the door once more, but he made no move to get up. "It's just a lot, you know," he said, his voice growing quieter. "I didn't expect this. I don't know what's going on." Miss Marple leaned forward just slightly, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "I'm sure you don't," she replied gently. "But you know something. You have information, don't you? Something about the body outside. You saw something, didn't you?" The young man flinched, and for the briefest moment, Miss Marple saw the flicker of something in his eyes. Fear, guilt. It was gone so quickly that she could hardly be sure, but it was enough to confirm her suspicions. He was hiding something, and whatever it was significant. Before she could speak again, the elderly man at the back of the bus cleared his throat. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "We could sit here all night, picking apart every nervous glance, every hesitant word. But the truth remains. We are stuck in a snowstorm with no way to get help. We must face the reality that we're all in this together, whether we like it or not." Miss Marple turned to face him, her gaze steady. "I'm not trying to pick apart anyone, sir," she said calmly. "But I'm trying to understand what's happened, and I do believe that each of you knows more than you're letting on. Including you." The elderly man met her gaze for a long moment, his eyes calculating, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slight sigh, he leaned back in his seat and said nothing more. The woman at the front of the bus shifted in her seat. "I don't know anything about the man outside," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I just saw him lying there, and I thought I was imagining it. I wasn't even sure. But when I saw the blood, I knew it wasn't a dream." Miss Marple nodded, acknowledging her words, but her eyes never left the young man. She could feel his discomfort like a tangible thing, and it confirmed her belief that he was the key to unlocking the truth. The bus remained still for a long while, the only sound the soft hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the metal frame as the snow continued to pile up against the windows. The wind howled outside, but inside, the silence was suffocating. Miss Marple glanced out the window, her mind working quickly. The body outside, the young man's fear, the woman's hesitation. There was something here, something important, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. The storm raged on, but Miss Marple knew that whatever came next, the truth was closer than ever. She could feel it, waiting just beneath the surface, ready to be uncovered. And in that moment, she was certain. The answers were inside this bus, hiding in plain sight. The snow had begun to slow, but the storm still loomed heavy in the distance, as if the world outside had been swallowed whole by the biting cold and endless white. Inside the bus, the stillness was almost unbearable, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the wheels and the soft hum of the engine. Miss Marple sat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching each of the passengers in turn. They all seemed to have settled into their own private worlds, but there was a shared unease that clung to the air like smoke. The young man, who had been the most nervous, now visibly worn, sat slumped in his seat, his eyes unfocused, his posture no longer defensive but defeated. The elderly man, who had been distant and cold, was now sitting rigid, his fingers tapping lightly on his knee, lost in his own thoughts. The woman who had seen the body outside, who had screamed in terror, sat near the front, her hands still clutching her purse as if it were a lifeline. Miss Marple could feel the tension between them all, the silent accusations, the unspoken secrets. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the young man. He was clearly uncomfortable, his body language betraying him. His hands shook, not as though from cold, but from fear, from guilt. She had seen enough people in her life to know the difference. He was hiding something big. The elderly man, perhaps sensing the same, let out a sharp breath, breaking the silence. We can't sit here forever, can we? The storm won't last much longer, but the longer we wait, the more likely we are to lose our nerve. Miss Marple turned her attention to him. Losing your nerve is not the issue, sir, she said softly. The issue is what happens when the storm is over. What happens when we're forced to face what's outside that door? The elderly man's eyes narrowed slightly. He was still measuring her, watching her, perhaps trying to decide if he should trust her or dismiss her. But Miss Marple wasn't fazed. She had dealt with such scrutiny before. She could almost see the cogs turning in his mind, the calculation behind his every move. "You've been quiet," Miss Marple continued, her voice steady as she addressed him. "But I sense you're holding back something. You've been sizing us all up since the moment we boarded." He stiffened at the words, but Miss Marple held his gaze, unwavering. Finally he spoke, though his voice was laced with resignation. "There's nothing to hide," he said, though the words came with a certain flatness. "But you're right. I've been thinking about this situation, about the man outside." "And what do you think?" Miss Marple asked, her tone soft but insistent. The elderly man's eyes flickered briefly to the young man, then to the woman in the front of the bus. "I think," he began slowly, "that we're all in this together, whether we like it or not. And I think we'll find that this situation isn't as random as it seems." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. His words were vague, but there was something behind them that sparked her curiosity. "Not random?" she echoed. "You believe someone here knows the man outside?" He didn't answer immediately, instead looking out the window for a moment. His silence stretched on, but Miss Marple knew he was weighing his words carefully. Finally, he spoke again, his voice lower this time. "I don't think it's about the man. I think it's about us," he said, almost to himself. "What we've done, or haven't done." The young man looked up sharply, his eyes widening. He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again without saying a word. Miss Marple could see the guilt flashing in his eyes, the way his body stiffened at the elderly man's words. It was enough to confirm her suspicion. He knew more than he was letting on. Miss Marple stood slowly, her legs stiff from sitting for so long. She walked toward the front of the bus, her shoes clicking softly against the floor, and stopped in front of the woman, who had first screamed at the sight of the body. The woman looked up at her, her face pale, her eyes haunted. "What did you see exactly?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but probing. "What do you remember about that moment?" The woman hesitated, her lips pressing together as though she was struggling with herself. Finally, she spoke, her voice shaking. I don't know," she said, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. "I saw the body. It was just lying there. I thought maybe it was a prank at first, but the blood was real, and then I just froze." Miss Marple regarded her for a long moment. "You're sure it was the blood that made you freeze?" she asked gently. The woman's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice faint with confusion. "I mean, was it the blood that stopped you from looking closer?" Miss Marple pressed. "Was it the blood that made you scream?" The woman's brow furrowed, and she seemed to think for a moment. I don't know. It all happened so fast." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind whirring with possibilities. There was something about the woman's reaction that didn't sit right. She wasn't just frightened. She was evasive. But why? What was she hiding? Turning back toward the young man, Miss Marple took a deep breath. "What do you know about the man outside?" she asked, her voice steady but insistent. He flinched, his entire body stiffening as though he had been caught. His lips trembled, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he might break down entirely. But instead, he simply shook his head, his eyes flickering between the elderly man and the woman. "I don't know anything," he muttered. "I swear." Miss Marple studied him carefully. His reaction told her everything she needed to know. He was lying, and whatever he was hiding was the key to everything. The tension in the bus had reached a breaking point. The passengers, who had been so silent before, were now looking at one another, each waiting for someone else to speak, each waiting for the truth to come to light. Miss Marple knew the answers were here, in this cramped, snowbound space, hidden in the subtle shifts of the passengers' eyes, their carefully guarded expressions. The storm might have been outside, but the real storm was inside the bus, and it was only just beginning. The minutes passed slowly, and the tension in the bus grew unbearable. The wind outside seemed to intensify, rattling the bus with a constant, unsettling roar, as if the storm itself were trying to tear them apart. Miss Marple could feel the weight of every gaze upon her, the eyes of the passengers following her every move, watching her carefully as though they too were waiting for something, anything that would break the silence. Each of them had been forced into a small, quiet corner of their own fears and suspicions, and Miss Marple knew that the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm brewing within the confines of the bus. The young man had grown increasingly agitated. His eyes darted to the window every few seconds, as though he expected to see someone or something waiting in the snow. He was no longer fidgeting, but his legs bounced nervously, and his lips moved as though he was rehearsing words he dared not say. The elderly man, still sitting near the back of the bus, remained outwardly calm but was rubbing his hands together, as if trying to keep the creeping chill from settling too deep. The woman who had first screamed was silent now, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and she avoided making eye contact with anyone, though her gaze flickered to Miss Marple every so often, as if she were trying to decide whether to speak or stay silent. Miss Marple studied them all, her mind sharp as ever, sifting through the small details, the fragments of conversations, the subtle shifts in posture. She had seen this before, the way fear could make people act in ways they didn't understand themselves, the way guilt could twist their words and gestures. There was a story here. She was certain of it, but it was buried beneath layers of confusion and avoidance. She had to peel those layers away, one by one, to find the truth. The woman at the front shifted in her seat and glanced toward the young man, who was staring out the window. For a moment, Miss Marple saw something in her eyes. An unspoken recognition, perhaps, or a flicker of fear that quickly turned to something else. The woman swallowed hard, then looked away quickly, her hands tightening around her purse again. "Why don't you tell us what you're not saying?" Miss Marple said softly, her voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. Her eyes never left the woman. The woman stiffened at the words. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said quickly, but Miss Marple could hear the tremor in her voice. It was a defensive response, the kind that came from someone trying to conceal something. "You're afraid of something," Miss Marple said, her tone calm, but there was an underlying firmness to it. "Afraid of what might come out if we start asking too many questions. But what is it you're afraid of exactly? Is it the body outside, or something else?" The woman's breath caught in her throat, and she turned her head away quickly, her eyes fixed on the window, though she didn't seem to be looking at anything outside. For a moment, there was silence, a heavy, almost suffocating silence that filled the space between them. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to the young man, and she could see the nervous twitch in his eyes, the way he was biting his lip, as though he were on the verge of saying something important, something that could change everything. Miss Marple knew the moment was coming. They were all on the edge, teetering on the brink of something that none of them could walk away from. The elderly man cleared his throat, breaking the silence, though his voice sounded strained. "This isn't helping," he said, his words clipped. "We're all trapped here, whether we like it or not. We need to focus on practical matters. The authorities will be here eventually, but right now, we're just wasting time." Miss Marple turned her gaze on him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, her voice sharp now. "Are you saying we should ignore what's happening? That we should just pretend that nothing is wrong?" The elderly man didn't flinch, though the faintest flicker of discomfort passed across his face. "I'm not saying that at all," he replied smoothly, though there was a trace of defensiveness in his voice. "But all this questioning and prying, it's not going to change anything. We're stuck in the middle of nowhere. We need to think about how to get out of here, how to survive." "You think it's about survival?" Miss Marple said quietly. "Because it's not just about getting out of here, is it? There's more at play here than you're letting on, and you know it." His lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't respond. His silence was more telling than anything else. Miss Marple stood then, her movements slow and deliberate. She could feel the tension in the air, the way it had thickened around them, like a fog that refused to lift. She knew she needed to take control of the situation, to bring the pieces together before it was too late. She took a step toward the young man, her eyes fixed on him. "You were the first to react," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You're the one who's been avoiding everyone's gaze, who's been fidgeting. You know more than you're letting on. And it's time you told the truth." The young man's face flushed and his hands clenched around the edge of the seat. He looked at Miss Marple, then looked away quickly, his breath coming faster now, his chest rising and falling with each shallow inhalation. He was about to crack, she could feel it, and she waited patiently for him to break. I don't know what you want me to say," he said, his voice trembling now. "I didn't do anything. I don't know anything about the body outside." Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice lowering. "Then why are you so scared? Why do you feel like you're being hunted?" For a long moment he didn't respond. Then his eyes flickered toward the elderly man, then back to Miss Marple. I didn't mean for it to happen," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." A heavy silence fell over the bus, and Miss Marple knew in that instant that the truth was finally within reach. The storm outside might have been fierce, but the storm within the bus was far more dangerous, and it was just about to break. The bus seemed to hold its breath as the young man's confession hung in the air like a thick fog. Miss Marple's eyes never wavered from him as he sank deeper into his seat, his face pale, his lips trembling with the weight of the words he had just uttered. The silence that followed was almost suffocating, and for a long moment, no one spoke. The others in the bus were frozen in place, caught in the gravity of what had just been revealed. The elderly man's gaze flickered toward the young man, his expression unreadable, though there was a subtle shift in his posture, a tightening as though something he had long suspected was finally confirmed. The woman at the front, still clutching her purse, had her hands pressed against her lap so tightly that her knuckles were white. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the young man with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The driver, his face pale beneath the dim light, shifted nervously from foot to foot, glancing between Miss Marple and the young man as though unsure what to do next. "I didn't mean for it to happen," the young man repeated, his voice barely a whisper, though it carried the weight of a confession. I didn't know what to do. It all happened so fast." Miss Marple stood still, her hands still folded in front of her, watching him with an almost detached calmness. "Tell me everything," she said softly, her voice steady and deliberate. "From the beginning." The young man swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the bus, looking for some escape, some way to avoid the truth, but there was nowhere to run now. He took a shaky breath before speaking, his words coming out in a rush, as though he were trying to rid himself of the weight that had settled upon his chest. "It was supposed to be a simple thing," he began, his voice trembling. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just wanted to stop him, to keep him quiet, It was a fight. We were both drunk. He kept pushing me, saying things I couldn't ignore anymore. I didn't know what to do, so I grabbed the cord. He paused, his breath catching. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to stop. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she processed his words. The connection was forming now, the pieces falling into place. The strangulation mark on the body, the panic in the young man's voice, the hesitation that had clouded his every movement. It all made sense now. The fight, the escalation. It had all started with a moment of violence and then spiraled out of control. "You're telling me," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but firm, "that this was an accident, that you didn't intend to kill him?" The young man nodded, his hands trembling in his lap. "Yes, that's what I'm saying. I didn't mean for it to go that far. I thought maybe if I could just quiet him, he'd stop. I never thought he'd die." Miss Marple considered his words for a long moment. There was something in his eyes, something that told her the truth was somewhere between the words he was speaking and the ones he was withholding. There was a lingering fear, a guilt that could not be masked by his nervous gestures or his shaky voice. But still she pressed on, needing the full picture. "And what happened after?" she asked, her voice cutting through the silence. "Did you leave him out there? Did you just walk away?" He hesitated, his gaze flicking to the window. "No," he said slowly. "I didn't leave him. I panicked. I didn't know what to do, so I dragged him out of the room. I thought maybe someone would find him later, think it was just some accident. I didn't want anyone to know it was me." The woman at the front gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "You killed him?" she asked, her voice shaking. "No, I didn't mean to," the young man repeated, his voice breaking. "It was an accident. It just happened so fast. I didn't plan any of it. I never wanted it to end like this." The elderly man finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "It doesn't matter what you intended," he said. "A man's dead, and we're all stuck in the middle of it. We can't undo what's been done." The young man's eyes darted to him, but the old man's face remained unreadable. The bus driver, who had remained silent for the most part, finally spoke up, his voice trembling. "What are we supposed to do now? Just wait for help? We're stuck here, with a dead man in the snow, and you think they'll just take us at our word?" Miss Marple turned to the driver, her expression calm but firm. "We wait, but we don't hide the truth. Not anymore." She looked back at the young man. "You can't undo what's happened, but you can tell the truth now, and that may make all the difference." The young man nodded slowly, his face contorting with a mixture of guilt and relief. He had said the words, had finally confessed, but Miss Marple knew that was only part of the battle. There were consequences, of course. There had to be. But for now, they were all still trapped in this isolated space, cut off from the world beyond the snowstorm. For a long while, there was nothing but the sound of the wind outside and the soft, rhythmic hum of the bus's engine. It was as though the world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for something to shift, for something to break the tension. Miss Marple knew the truth had been spoken, but it didn't feel like a release. Not yet. The pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, but the aftermath, the consequences of this revelation, still loomed large. The storm outside raged on, but inside the bus, the storm was far from over. The bus had become a confessional, the atmosphere thick with secrets that were no longer whispered but laid bare for all to hear. The young man's confession had cracked the dam open, but as the storm outside howled relentlessly against the bus, Miss Marple knew that the most difficult part was still to come. There was no way to undo what had been done, no way to erase the violence that had unfolded under the shadow of a drunken argument. But the truth was now out in the open, and it was no longer just a matter of guilt or innocence. It was a matter of survival. The passengers sat in tense silence, each one processing the young man's words in their own way. The elderly man remained unmoved, his face a mask of impassivity, but Miss Marple noticed the subtle shift in his posture, a slight tightening of his hands in his lap. The woman, who had once been so fearful and evasive, now stared blankly ahead, her grip still tight on her purse, but her eyes hollow, as though she were trying to retreat into herself. The driver, ever restless, had moved to the front of the bus, his back to the rest of them, his shoulders hunched in a way that suggested he was trying to distance himself from the events unfolding inside the bus. Miss Marple took a deep breath, steadying herself before she spoke again. The truth was a double-edged sword. It could offer some form of clarity, but it could also unravel everything in a way that no one could anticipate. "Now that the truth is out," she began, her voice calm, though it carried the weight of something much heavier, "we have to face what comes next. The question is, what do we do with this knowledge?" The young man, still sitting stiffly in his seat, looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed, his face pale with the strain of his confession. "What are you asking me to do?" he whispered, his voice trembling with uncertainty. "I've already told you everything." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes softening. "I'm not asking you to do anything," she said quietly. "I'm asking us all to face the truth, and that includes you. We are all in this together now, whether we want to be or not. And now that we know what happened, the next question is how we move forward." The young man's eyes flickered with fear, and he opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The silence that followed was heavy, each person in the bus suspended in that fragile moment of uncertainty, unsure of what to say or do next. The elderly man, who had remained so composed up until now, finally broke the silence, his voice sharp and commanding. "We don't have time for moral lectures," he said, his eyes flashing with a mixture of frustration and urgency. "The storm isn't getting any better, and we're stuck here with a dead body outside. We can't just sit around and wait for rescue. We need a plan. We need to figure out how to survive." The young man shrank back at the words, his face crumpling with shame. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he muttered, his voice cracking. I didn't want to kill him." Miss Marple's gaze softened as she regarded him. "I believe you," she said quietly. "But whether you meant to or not, a life has been lost. And now we are all left to deal with the consequences of that loss." The woman in the front of the bus shifted, her hand still gripping her purse tightly, but she looked up at Miss Marple, her expression weary. "What are we supposed to do?" she asked, her voice quiet but edged with panic. "How do we go on from here? We're stuck. We're trapped." "There's no easy answer to that," Miss Marple replied, her voice firm. "But what we must understand is that, for now, we are all responsible for what happens next. We cannot undo what has been done, but we can choose how we handle what comes after. The storm may pass, but the truth will remain." The young man, still shaking, looked around the bus, his eyes darting from one person to the next, searching for some sign of understanding, some sign that they didn't all view him as a monster. But the silence that filled the bus only deepened the feeling of isolation that had settled over him. He was alone, left to carry the weight of his actions in a way that felt as though it would crush him. The driver, who had remained silent until now, turned to face the group, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. "We've got to stick together," he said, his voice a little rough, though it seemed to gain strength as he spoke. "No matter what. We can't afford to fall apart now. We'll get through this. We just have to hold it together until help arrives." Miss Marple's eyes flickered to him and she nodded. "That's right," she said softly. "We can't fall apart. Not yet. But we can't pretend nothing has happened either. We have to face it even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's difficult." The woman's voice trembled as she spoke again. "What do we do about the body?" she asked. "Do we just leave him out there?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, we can't just leave him. But neither can we simply pretend nothing happened. We need to wait for the authorities, but we also need to stay vigilant. We need to be honest with ourselves and with each other." The elderly man let out a long sigh, his face grim. "And then what?" he muttered. "We wait for rescue and hope for the best." "That's all we can do for now," Miss Marple said, her voice steady but firm. "But we can do it with the understanding that we are all in this together. No one can escape what's happened, but together we might find a way to survive it." As the bus remained still in the swirling snow, the weight of the words hung heavy in the air. The storm outside was relentless, but within the confines of the bus, the storm was far from over. The passengers had been forced to confront the truth, and now they were left to navigate the consequences of their own secrets, the guilt and fear weighing heavily on each of them as they faced the long road ahead. The storm had finally begun to subside, though the weight of its passing lingered in the air, the oppressive silence broken only by the occasional creak of the bus and the soft hum of the engine. Outside, the snow was still thick on the ground, but the wind had eased. Miss Marple sat still, her eyes moving from one passenger to the next, her mind focused as she pieced together the last remnants of the puzzle. The young man, once racked with guilt and fear, had quieted somewhat after his confession, but the unease in his posture never fully left. He sat hunched in his seat, his eyes shifting nervously between the others, as if waiting for a condemnation he feared might come at any moment. The elderly man, who had once seemed so distant and cold, was now lost in thought, his brow furrowed as if wrestling with some internal conflict. The woman at the front of the bus had grown quieter still, her eyes downcast, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had seemed to retreat further and further into herself, her earlier anxiety replaced by a kind of resigned acceptance. Miss Marple had watched them all closely over the last few hours, and she knew that while the truth had been spoken, it had not yet fully come to light. There were still gaps, still pieces of the story missing, and while they had admitted the obvious, the murder outside, it was not the only secret lurking in the corners of the bus. She had felt it from the beginning. Something had been off about this entire situation. The passengers' behavior, their strange reluctance to speak, the way they avoided eye contact. There was more to this than a drunken argument gone wrong. She turned her attention to the woman in the front seat, who had been so reluctant to speak up. "You've been quiet, my dear," Miss Marple said softly, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "Perhaps it's time you told us everything you know." The woman flinched at the words, her gaze flickering toward the window. She had been staring out at the snow, her face pale and drained, but now she turned back toward Miss Marple, her lips trembling slightly. I don't know what more there is to say," she said, her voice small, almost apologetic. Miss Marple regarded her carefully. "You don't know, or you don't want to say?" Her eyes never left the woman's face, noting the subtle shift in her expression, a flicker of something, a shadow of guilt perhaps, that passed over her features. The woman's fingers tightened around her purse, and she looked down at her lap as though trying to hide from the detective's gaze. She swallowed hard, then, with a deep breath, spoke. "I didn't want it to go this way. I didn't want anyone to get hurt," she began, her voice quieter now, almost as if she were trying to convince herself. "But I knew what was happening. I knew it was only a matter of time before things escalated. I didn't think it would go this far." The young man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and Miss Marple turned her attention briefly to him, watching as his eyes widened in disbelief. He had been so focused on his own guilt that it seemed he hadn't considered the possibility that someone else had been involved in this tragedy. "Please go on," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but insistent. The woman glanced around the bus as though weighing her options, then finally let out a sigh. "I knew about him, about the man outside. He wasn't who he said he was. He was blackmailing me." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Blackmailing you?" The woman nodded, her face now flushed with shame. I'd known him for months. He kept threatening to expose things about my past, things I thought I had left behind. I didn't know what to do, and when he showed up that night, drunk and angry, She paused, the words sticking in her throat. I just wanted it to stop. I thought I could control the situation. Miss Marple took a steadying breath. So, it wasn't just a fight between two men. It was far more complicated than that. The young man's involvement was not as simple as a crime of passion. And the woman, though innocent in some ways, had been complicit in her own way. Her role in this had been hidden behind the facade of her own fear and guilt. "And what did you do?" Miss Marple asked gently, though her voice held a note of accusation. I gave him the cord," she confessed, her eyes brimming with tears. "I thought if I could just stop him from threatening me, if I could just make him be quiet, maybe he'd leave me alone. But when he grabbed me, when he threatened to expose everything, I panicked." She choked on the last words, her breath hitching in her chest. "I didn't mean for him to die. He wouldn't stop. And when he fell, I couldn't do anything." Miss Marple's heart sank, though her face remained as composed as ever. This was it, the final piece of the puzzle. The young man hadn't killed the man out of malice. He had done it in a fit of panic, not understanding the full consequences of his actions. But the woman, though guilty of no direct murder, had set the stage for the tragedy that followed. Her silence, her fear, had fueled the escalation. The elderly man, who had been listening in silence, spoke then, his voice heavy with resignation. "So it was all a mistake then," he said quietly. "One mistake after another. We've all played our part in this." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Yes," she said softly. "But some mistakes are harder to undo than others, and we must all live with the consequences of our choices, no matter how much we wish they could be erased." The young man sat up straighter, his face pale and stricken. "So, what happens now? What do we do?" Miss Marple turned her gaze to him, her expression steady. "Now, we wait for the authorities to come. We tell them the truth. Every last bit of it." He nodded, his face still a mixture of guilt and disbelief. The woman, too, nodded, her hands trembling in her lap, the weight of her actions finally crashing down on her. Oh, and so they sat in the bus, the storm outside slowly dying down, each of them carrying the burden of the truth in their hearts. The silence was still heavy, but there was a quiet understanding now that had not been there before. They would face the consequences of their actions together, and the world outside, though cold and indifferent, would move on. But for this small group of strangers, the storm inside the bus had not yet passed, and the true cost of their secrets was only just beginning to unfold. The snow had stopped falling, but the truth, unforgiving and cold, had settled over them all, like the quiet aftermath of a storm that could never truly be undone.